Welcome back to Piyut, Shiurim in Piyut. This time we're going to continue with the Karova Uyamti Bechil Kippur for the first day of Sukkot, which we began last time. Last time we looked at the Magain, the first component of the Karova, adorning the first bracha of the Amidah. And this time, let's look at the next component, the Mahayeh, adorning the second bracha of the Amidah, Mahayeh HaMetim. Here we are. Uyamti Bechil Kippur, Kedushta for the first day of Sukkot, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Kilir, or as traditionally pronounced, Kalir, 6th to 7th century Eretz Israel. Part 2, Mahayeh. Mahayeh, as we said, goes in the second bracha of the Amidah, and thus must conclude Mahayeh HaMetim, who resurrects the dead. We, of course, today always begin with Atagi Bor La'olam, you are always mighty. But at the time when these piyutim were being written, the piyut would replace the text, most of the text of the baracha. So rather than saying Atagi Bor, the Chazan would continue immediately after Magen Avraham, would continue immediately with Ma'alemei Magadim Arba'a, beginning of our piyut. In Ashkenaz, in medieval, roughly German-speaking lands, they would begin, the Chazan would begin with Atagi Bor and say the whole text of the bracha until right before the end, until right before Baruch Ata Hashem Machayeh HaMetim, then say the piyut and then conclude Baruch Ata Hashem Machayeh HaMetim, and this is indeed how the piyut is recited today. The acrostic for this piyut, as we'll see here, and this is true in many Krovot by Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Kilir, simply continues the alphabetical acrostic of the Magain. This is not true in all of his Kiddush Ta'ot, because in some of them he will do a full alphabet in the Magain and a full alphabet in the Mahayeh, but those, of course, are much longer. In his shorter style, he splits the alphabet between them. And of course, what that shows you is when you're looking at it, you can't just look at each of these components separately and say, oh, it's a piyut, oh, it's another piyut. The Karova is a composition as a whole. I'm using the word Kiddushta here, it's a type of Karova, which you'll see you'll remember from the first shiur, a Karova for an Amidah that contains the Kiddusha prayer. So it continues the acrostic. Straight continuation of the previous piyut. But a difference is that unlike there where we saw each letter was used once, here the poet's going to use each letter of the alphabet twice, the beginning of consecutive lines. Thus, here, this is the Vormt Maser in the 13th century, but you can see here, Uyamti Aleph, Biruta, third word on the second line, Bet, Galti, the third word from the end on the second line, Gimel, Dolek, Hudra'u, Vitsumatu, Zakim. See, he's using one letter each, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dal. Then you've got the Psukim, and then the Churuj, the conclusion going into the Hatima, Bach, Agila, Esmecha, etc. Then, as I explained, in Ashkenaz, they would say the full text, and this is done to this day in Ashkenazic synagogues, Atagi Bor. And you see it goes all the way up to Umatzmiach Yishu'av and E'eman Atala Hayot Meitim, then comes the piyut. But here, instead of each letter once, Ma'alamei Magadim Arba'a, Mem. Mishamrei Sukkah Shiva, also Mem. Noschei Nezel Shiva, Nun. Nahaleim Olamot Shiva, Samech, etc. And here I printed out in a very clear way. You can see the Mem, Mem, Nun, Nun, Samech, Shin, Samech, Sin, left hand Shin, Shin Smalit, Ayin, Pei, Tzadi, Tzadi. You can see he's going through the letters twice. Now, of course, you saw that I hesitated a bit with the first Samech. It doesn't look like a samach. It sounds like a samach, sihim, but it doesn't look like a samach. Now, in fact, in biblical Hebrew, those two letters are distinct and reflect different etymologies. But in later Hebrew, with the sounds completely merged, the symbols, the letters are often used interchangeably. You see this even with modern Hebrew. How do you spell the word to grab? Tafas can be spelled with a samech or with a what they call a sin, a shin smalit, a shin with the dot on the left hand, making the same sound as the samech. But you'll see in this Geniza fragment, as we spoke about in the first shiur, this piyut is attested, this whole krova is attested mostly in European manuscripts and, of course, printings, but there are fragments of it in the Cairo Geniza. We also discussed what the Cairo Geniza is. And you see here, it's spelled with a samech. See, ma'alamei magadei arba'a mem. You can't see the first nun, but then you say nosechei, nun, right under magadei, you see the nun nosechei. And then on the next line, you see where the red arrow is, the one word to the right, the penultimate word on that line, sihim. It's not so clear, but it's spelled samech yud het yud mem. Just noting that although we use the usual spelling, which is the biblical and etymological spelling of the word siah, plant, with the sin, let's call it, it could be spelled with the samach. Okay, now let's look at some sources before we can actually read the piyut. Psalm 6:11. Todi'eni orach hayim sova samachot et panecha ni'imot bimincha netzach. Teach me the path of life, satiety of joy in thy presence, being totally full, satiated with joy, totally, not exactly in English, we'd say intoxicated with joy, full of joy. But the idea is that you've eaten, you're taking your fill. You've eaten or drunk your fill of joy. You're totally filled with joy. Sweetness at thy right hand forever. Why are we quoting this pasuk? Does that have anything to do with Sukkot? Well, let's look in this Midrash. Psikta to Rav Kahana, 27:2, also found in Leviticus Rabbah 32. As we mentioned last time, Psikta Rav Kahana is a Midrash which is organized not around the Parshat of the Torah, but around the holidays, the special readings of the year. This one is for Sukkot. Sova samachot et panecha, as we saw in the verse, satiety of joy in thy presence. Alte korekein ella sheva samachot. Don't read sova samachot, satiety of joy, but sheva samachot, 7 joys. Elu sheva kitot shel tzadikim shematidim lakbil panei hashchina uvnehem domot lachamal lavana larakia labrakim lakochavim lashoshanim limnorot bet hamikdash. The 7 classes of tzadikim who in the future are going to greet the presence of the divine presence. It's different words in Hebrew. We translate the Hashachina as the divine presence, the almost physical manifestation of God, almost visual. The Gilui Shechina, we say, is the visual manifestation of God, with God being everywhere, but the Shechina being what you can see, reflecting God's presence. Okay, but we'll greet the presence. We'll greet the Shechina. And their faces will be like all these shining, beautiful things, the sun, the moon, the sky, lightning, the stars, Shoshanim, flowers, and the menorahs of the temple. Another interpretation. Satiety of joy, Sova Samachot. Again, they're going to read it Sova as Seva, as Sheva, 7. This refers to the 7 mitzvot of the festival, Sukkot. Sukkot is called Hehag, the festival, already in the Bible in some places, and then definitely in rabbinic literature. What are they? The 4 species in the lulav, they count as 4. The lulav in the strict sense, meaning the palm frond. the hadassim, the myrtles, the aravot, the willows, and the etrog, citron. That's 4. The sukkah, that's 5. And then these 2 sacrifices, the simcha and the chagiga. The chagiga being the festival sacrifice, which is the shlamim offering, which is whose flesh is consumed mostly by the offerers. And the simcha, an additional sacrifice, also a shlamim, but also which is for the celebration, for joy of the festival. It's odd that these 2 are mentioned here because those are obligations on each of the 3 pilgrimage festivals of the year, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. They are not specifically for Sukkot, so it's not clear why they're mentioned here. I thought that I remembered a version of this midrash which lists some other peculiarities of Sukkot, the Nisuch HaMayim, the water libation, which is offered with the Tamid sacrifice only during the days of Sukkot. There's wine libations all year round. There's an additional water libation on Sukkot, the period right before the onset of the rainy season. And perhaps other Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which was the all-night party which went on in the temple all night in the days on most of the days of Sukkot. But I said, sir, I looked up many versions of the midrash and I did not find either of those. So perhaps I imagined it. It seems to be a phantom. But look at the Mishnah. Perhaps I confused that with the Mishnah, which will also be important here. The 4th chapter of Mishnah Sukkah, which deals with the laws of Sukkot, lists numerically various mitzvot of the holiday and tells you how many days they're observed. Lulav v'arava. The lulav, which is not just the palm branch, but the full bouquet of the 4 species. And the arava, the special willow separate from the lulav, which in the temple was part of the ritual in some way or another throughout most of the week of Sukkot. But we have a separate arava only on the last day, on the 7th day, Hoshana Rabbah, when after we've marched around, processed with the lulav, with the 4 species, we pick up the bundle of aravot separately. So the lulav and willow are observed for 6 or 7 days. Why 6 or 7? Because one of the days could be Shabbat. If the first day is Shabbat, then the lulav was taken all 7 days. And if the last day, the 7th day, was Shabbat, then the arava, the willow, was taken all 7 days. But if Shabbat fell during the week of Sukkot, then the lulav and the arava would be put down, would be not held that day. So it would be only 6 days. So they're taken for 6 or 7 days. Hallel, the recitation of Hallel, and Simcha, the sacrifice we talked about, or perhaps joy in general, are observed for 8 days, right? Sukkot continues on into an 8th day. You don't have the mitzvah of lulav or arava, but the holiday's not over, so 8 days. Sukkah v'nisuch hamayim shiva, the sukkah and the water libation, which we just discussed, are observed for 7 days. Halil, the flute of the Beit HaShoeva party, which we also just discussed, the all-night party, chamisha v'shisha, because that party would never begin until Chol HaMoed, so it would never take place the first night of Sukkot, and it would be canceled for Shabbat. So it would be only on the weekdays of Chol HaMoed. There can be 6 weekdays of Chol HaMoed if the first day is Shabbat, or there can be 5 days of weekday Chol HaMoed if the first day is not Shabbat, if Shabbat falls during Chol HaMoed. Good. What is the poet going to make of all of this? First stanza, Ma'alemei Magadim Arba'a, Meshamerei Sukkah Shiv'a, Nosachei Nezel Shiv'a, Nahaleim Imot Shiv'a. Those that bind the plants, the 4. You already see he's working with the numbers. The Mishnah didn't have 4, but implicit in the word lulav, which is the bouquet of four species. Plants, the four. And you see arba'ah rhymes with shiv'ah, 4 and 7. They both have the bet, ayin, hey at the end. Those that bind the plants, ma'allameh. Ma'allameh means to bind. It's an interesting word. Where's that coming from? Not the word the Mishnah uses. When it talks about binding the four species, it talks about it uses the word eget. Legod. What's ma'allameh? Okay, the verse in Genesis 37:7, Joseph's dream. He dreams that he's with his brothers. Lo, we were all binding sheaves in the midst of the field. Okay, so ma'alame means to bind. Very good. Now we know this word. Those that observe Sukkah for 7 days, right? That was in the Mishnah. Sukkah v'dichamayim, shiv'ah, the Sukkah, the water libation, are observed for 7 days. But before we go on, we bind 4 plants. I thought we bind 3. We typically bind the lulav, the hadas, and the arafah, and we hold the etrog in the other hand. Well, my friend Yaakov Yisrael Stahl, Yankee Stahl, has written a long article, longish article, Agidat Etrog im Shloshet Aminim, binding the etrog with the other 3 species, in his book Nahagu Yisrael. He argues, based on this piyut and a number of other piyutim which talk about binding the 4 species, and evidence from art, that in fact there was a practice to bind all 4. It's not easy to bind the etrog with the other 4, the other 3. Do we bind 4? Look here, synagogue mosaic at Hamat Tiberias. May not look like the etrog is connected to lulav. May look like it's next to it. I mean, you can see clearly there's a menorah, a incense pan, a shofar. That's clearly the arba aminim, the 4 species. But are they connected? Let's look close up. Yes. In the one on the right, it's clearly right adjacent to it. It's hard to see how it's connected, but it is. The one on the left, it's very clear the stem, the okats or ukats, the end of the etrog, is clearly bound to the other species. That's not easy to do. Synagogue mosaic at Sepphoris. You can see the etrog has a long stem. See on the left, the right, there's a shofar, but on the left, you see that there's a stem coming out and it goes to the other species. It's bound together with them. Here, there's a marble slab at a synagogue in Andriaka. See, there's a menorah, shofar. Here, one could argue artistic license. It's just next to it. But if you look, it does touch, and there is that weird stem that's somehow connected to the others. Mind you, this is not the pitum. The pitum's on the other side. The oketz is the stem. Here, you can see the lulav with the etrog coming out on the side. There's plenty of space where the artist could have done, this is in bas relief, could have carved out the etrog to the bottom right, the space between the menorah and the lulav. But no, we see it's connected on the side to the lulav just in these others. So Rabbi Stahl argues that when you put together this artistic evidence and the piyutim, and there are many of them that talk about binding 4 species, that it seems that a practice in antiquity was indeed to bind all 4 species. But here's more. It's the side of a coffin from Beit Sha'arim, and again, it has symbols of Judaism on it. The menorah, the incense pan on the right, the shofar above the incense pan, and on the left, this is a lulav with 2 etrogim coming out of it. He has another article talking about the practice of having 2 etrogim, just as even today we have 2 hadassim, with 3 hadassim, 2 aravot. Seems to have been a practice to have 2 etrogim, but the important thing here is that they are very clearly connected to the lulav. Here's a coin from the Jewish revolt. This coin was minted at the time when the temple was still standing. Shortly, it says Gulatzion. It's from the year of the redemption of Zion. They thought that this revolt would end in success and that they would throw off Roman oppression. But sadly, ended up being the year of destruction of the temple, leading to all the further tzarot, all the further troubles that befell the Jewish people. Point is, though, they're these two etrogim, and they seem to be connected. Yes, because you see there are leaves of some kind. I don't know if those are coming out of the lulav or coming out of the lulav or coming out of the other species, the hadassim and the aravot, which are bushy in front of the lulav. But you see those little balls; those are leaves from one of the plants, and you see that the etrog is connected to it, both of them. Rabbi Stahl is an independent scholar, independent researcher. He doesn't have any institution that's backing him, but he's doing wonderful work, putting together piyutim, and not just piyutim that are in our machzorim, but piyutim that are in the Geniza, that modern scholars have published, that few people have read. He's putting together information from that together with information that you find from other sources, such as art, and coming up with real innovative ideas. So support his work. If you want more work like this, if you want to see more scholarship like this, we need your help. So here's this link, and I will post it down below on the description of the video. Let's move on. מעלמי מגדים 4, משמרי סוכה 7, נוסחי נזל 7, נהלים נעימות 7. Those that make water libations for days, 7. 4, 7. Okay, that was in the Mishnah. 7 days of water libation, just as there's 7 days of Sukkah. What's Nezel? I thought water was Mayim. So we see in Tanakh, in a number of places, that nozel, the verb nazal means to flow, to drip, really to flow. Arabic nazala just means to go down, like yarad in Hebrew. But in Hebrew, it's used of water or liquids to flow. Nozlim in modern Hebrew means liquids in general. But we see in a few verses in Tanakh that nozlim is used as in a synonym, in parallelism with water. By the breath of your nostrils, waters were heaped up. Nozlim stood up like a pile. Those that flow stood up like a pile. Water. Drink water from your own well, and nozlim from your own cistern. And then we got this third verse here, which uses the word mayim and nozlim together. They're not exactly in parallelism. Nozlim seems to be an adjective describing mayim, but we will go back to that verse in Jeremiah further on. So if it's nozlim, why does the poet write nezel? Exegolate is a Hebrew noun whose uninflected form, that's the singular with no suffixes, is one of the following. Like melech, like sefer, or like ochel. And we don't need to get into the etymology of this, that the segol here is really a helping vowel, and really fundamentally, etymologically, these nouns originally had only one vowel, and you see this in the inflections. You see melech, malki. You don't see melechi because it's malk, one vowel, e, malki. But we don't have to get into that now. Point is here, this is called a segolate, and the Paitanim loved inventing new words on this pattern. So from this root, nun zayin lamed v'nozelim, nozelim, we get nezel. And now we have this word, means water. Those that libate water, that libate nezel, 7 days. Nahaleim ni'imot shiv'ah. Lead them to sweet experiences. I wrote sweet experiences rather than just sweetness to capture the pluralness, because if you have 7, if you have a number, it's got to be plural and not just some abstract ending in ot. Na'aleim ni'imot shiv'ah. Where is this from? That verse in Psalms that we saw. Ni'imot bimincha netzach, sweetness at thy right hand forever. There I just translated sweetness in the singular rather than sweet experiences because we didn't have a number next to it. However, this might actually not be a number because there are manuscripts and printed editions that vocalize Nahaleim ni'imot sov'ah. Let them be satiated with sweet experiences. Already at the beginning, we saw that sova and sheva, satiety and 7, are spelled the same way in Hebrew. And what depends, the pronunciation is what changes it, which we indicate with the nekudot. So you see here in this manuscript, in an Eastern Ashkenazic manuscript in the Munich Bavarian State Library from the 13th to 14th century, and you can see where I wrote the line, where I put the red line. Nezel shiv'ah nahaleim ni'imot sov'ah, to be satiated with. Or here the Rittelheim Machzor, 1815. Wolf Heidenheim vocalizes nahaleim ni'imot sov'ah. If it is Shiva, what does it mean? Could refer to the Midrash, which talks about the seven groups of tzaddikim who will each greet the Shekhinah. Although it doesn't seem that 7 groups would be 7 experiences. It could simply mean, and this is in fact how, in a manuscript commentary, I think in the Tripartite Machzor, it explains it, lead them to sweetness for the 7 days of Sukkot. Nahaleim ni'imot Shiva, on the 7 days, just as Noschei Nezel Shiva and Meshamarish Sukkah Shiva were 7 days of Sukkot. Could be that. Second stanza. Sihim b'derech mata'atam, sololim sachot shav'atam. Plants in the direction that they grow. This is a halacha about the 4 species. The 4 species of lulav must be held in the direction of their growth. That's why we hold with the pitum in a specific direction, and the lulav with the leaves pointing up, and the hadasim and the aravot, all with the leaves pointing up as they grow. I quoted this from the Yerushalmi, both because that's the Talmud that the poet would have had access to, Rabbi Elazar Bar Kilir in the 6th, 7th century in Eretz Israel, and also because the formulation is clearer than how this halacha is formulated in the Talmud Bavli, which is the Talmud that we usually study. But this certainly gets codified as halacha, and all the halachic codes say this is how you have to hold a lulav. Why mata'atam? In the direction of their growth, their planting. What's that? Mata'atam is their mata'atam. But there's no word mata'ah. Matah exists, appears in a number of verses in the Bible, but not mata'ah. So the poet made this as an ad hoc feminine form of matah. Why? This is not typical of Rabbi Elazar Bar Kilir. Later, a few hundred years later, it would be typical of Rav Saadia Gaon to create, to add the vowel ah to nouns to create feminine forms of masculine nouns. You see the opposite in Rabbi Elazar Bar Kilir, that will be nouns in ending in ah, from which he will remove the ah and often turn them into segolates because he loves creating segolates so much. But he doesn't typically do this. So why does he do it here? Has to do with the rhyme. So in Hebrew rhyme, the whole last syllable needs to rhyme. So tam, 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 this is good. But tam, tam, tam is not good. In English, that would be fine. But in Hebrew, that's not an acceptable rhyme. So he can't write mata'am. So he writes mata'atam. When he needs to, he absolutely will create innovative, ad hoc, feminine forms of masculine nouns to create the rhyme. He just doesn't do it for no purpose as Reb Saadia would do a couple hundred years later. Mata'atam, shav'atam, nityatam, tiviatam. They rhyme. Solalim, sechot, shavatam. They lift the four species so their prayer will be heard. But does solalim mean lift? That is indeed how Wolf Heidenheim, in his aforementioned Machzor commentary in the early 19th century, takes this word, and following him, Daniel Goldschmidt, in his important scientific Machzor, in which he wrote, he was working on shortly before his death in the early 1970s, and was published by his son-in-law, Professor Yona Frankel, in the early 1980s. And that's what we do with the four species, but the word doesn't usually mean that. It can mean to praise. Solu larochev ba'aravot. Give praise to the one who dwells up high in heaven. So it could be plants in the direction that they grow. They praise with them because we hold them while we recite Hallel. So the four species become part of the prayer. It's a little bumpy, though, because it doesn't say Solalim Bahem. They praise with them. It just says Solalim. They lift. They praise. And there are other understandings one can also have of this verb, which I'm not going to get into right now. So Solim Sechot Shavatam, so that their prayer will be heard, or literally to hear their prayer, for the hearing of their prayer. What's Sechot? To hear is Lishmoa, right? Or Lahazin, to give ear. Sechot is a common Paitanic word. If you've perhaps seen in the Ashkenazic Machzor in Rosh Hashanah and Kippur and Slichot, and perhaps other occasions, you'll see that this shoresh, this root sin kaf tav, is used. Comes from one appearance in Tanakh. Vaydaber Moshe v'hakohanim halaviyim el kol Yisrael lemor haskeit u'shema Yisrael. Listen and hear. I mean, from context, it's got to mean that. So, and the Paitanim use this, and they use this word regularly. Incidentally, modern Hebrew also created a word from this. A taskit is a radio play. Okay. Sichim b'derach mata'atam sololim sechot shavatam. Alei karim netiatam. They are planted along the waters. Oh, I reddened the wrong word. It's the word waters that should be reddened. Never mind. How does karim mean waters? We saw zarim. We saw nozelim. But what about karim? Karim also means to flow, to pour forth. You mean not to shumayim, zarim, karim, nozelim. Will there ever be an end to the waters? Pouring forth karim, flowing, nozelim. We already saw that word. So this seems to be related to the noun makor, a spring, a source, a fountain. That which flows from the makor is kar, they are karim. Those which that the makor is that from which they are kar. So it looks like the word for cold. It looks like this means, will there ever be an end to the cold waters pouring forth, flowing? And indeed, most English translations of the verse translate it that way, but it doesn't seem that there's any relevance to coldness here. Karim here seems to mean flowing. And indeed, the Paitan here uses karim to mean water. So they're planted along the waters. Alot bamo bitviatam, to ascend through them from their drowning. What does that mean? So just as these four species grow on water, which is a fact that we see emphasized in Midrashim sometimes in various connections, mostly because this is the holiday right before the rainy season, when the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah says, the world is judged regarding the water that it's going to receive during the winter on Sukkot, and that these species allude to that. But here, the Paitan is making his own understanding of the connection to water. They grow alongside water, the species, so that we can get up out of our drowning, the disasters that we are plunged into. Halot bamo mitivi atam, in the whole difficult period starting from the time of the destruction of the temple till today, the feeling that we're drowning, we're treading water. And in fact, this imagery appears already in the Bible, in the Psalms. Rescue me from mud, that I not drown, that I not submerge in it. So I may be spared from my enemies and from deep waters. Why is the psalmist talking both about the enemies and the water? Because it seems it's not physical water. The psalmist is not writing this underwater. I mean, how would you write? The parchment would depends how strong the parchment is, but you can't really write underwater. It's metaphorical for suffering, again, spared from my enemies, and in general, the troublesome times, poverty and difficulties. Next stanza. This one's very easy there. Gloriously adorned, Pu'urim, like Pe'er Tiferet, for the sake of the day, so that we may glorify through them Ayom, the awesome one, that's God. The commandment to take them today in a pure manner. This is going to lead into the Pasukim, the first Pasuk specifically. To take them, Rishon Yom, on this first day. As the verse says, you shall take for yourselves, take, Bayom Rishon, on the first day, the fruit of the beautiful tree, and fronds of palms, and branches of the thick tree, and willow brooks, and you shall rejoice in the presence of the Lord your God for 7 days. That the pasuk commanding the taking of the 4 species. And it is said, says the Lord's trees are satiated, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. Cedars aren't directly connected to Sukkot, but it's trees. And we talked about satiety, we talked about trees, and this is a verse talking about trees drinking their fill of water. It's not the right species of trees, but it fits here. Now, the righteous shall flourish like a palm, grow great like a cedar in the Lebanon. This connects the cedar of the previous verse with the palm tree, which is where we get the lulav from. It said give a portion to 7 and to 8. This is a verse in Kohelet. We don't have to get into the meaning and context here, but the numbers 7 and 8 appear here, just as we saw numbers, we saw 7 and 4 in the verse, but 8 is relevant to Sukkot too. It's the 8 days, including the last day when we don't take the lulav, but it's part of the holiday. And so this connects as well. This verse, will you not come back and give us life? Life. This is, after all, the theme of the bracha, Mahayam Eitim, gives life to the dead. So you have that. So thy people may rejoice in thee. This is certainly connected to Sukkot Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. Thou shalt rejoice on thy festival. Yismechu vach, and that last word bach, there's going to be sheshur and a diplosis. The last word of this pasuk is going to be the first word of the next stanza, which we'll get to in a moment. But first, remember Zulai's law? In our first shiur, we talked about Hog Zulai. The first verse of the verse chain of the Magain is the first verse of the day's Torah reading, and we saw that. The first verse of the verse chain of the Mahaya is the second verse of the day's Torah reading. So that's not going on here. Ukachtem lachem is something like the 40th verse. I think more than 40 of, more than 40, something like the 45th verse of the day's Torah reading. It is a verse directly connected to the mitzvah of the day, unlike the beginning of the Torah. It begins with some laws regarding sacrifices and regarding some other things, and then it goes through all the various holidays, and Sukkot comes only at the end. So clearly the poet wanted to go straight into a verse dealing directly with the mitzvah of the day. But this is unusual. This is a rare exception. It's not typically what happens. So we looked at the first chain. The last one is Bach. Bach agila ve'esmacha begila ve'simcha. And you are in you, in God, I will be glad and happy with joy and happiness. In the happy mother of children, be'ema banim smecha, which is a line from Hallel, which we recite on Sukkot. And as we said in the previous shiur, refers here either to Jerusalem, the city, or to the Jewish people, amidst the Jewish people. Let us be bedewed with life-giving, which will spring up. And the life-giving there links to the conclusion of the bracha, the Hatima, Baruch Hashem, Mechayei Hametim, who gives life to the dead. Now, this is almost exactly the same churuj, almost the exact same conclusion we saw at the end of the Magen. This is also rare. Typically, the Magen and the Haya will have each of them will have a completely different churuj. Here, for some reason, the poet wanted to write the same one. The second line, Megillah v'simcha, Barimna v'simcha, joyous song and happiness, or joy and happiness. This is not important. And in fact, you see in manuscripts, it can go back and forth, and either one can be either one. And all this is how most Machzorim today have it. This is not really a difference. And my guess, I honestly don't know. Did the poet try to vary it, or is it simply this is a result of the variety that results from copyists? But the last line, the Magen had on the left, Gonenenu bifdut samecha. Shield us, shield of Abraham, with deliverance which will spring up. Here we have bedewed with life-giving, which will spring up. Life-giving, I understand. Why bedewed? So, the time of the Baitanim, as we said, the whole bracha was replaced with the piyot. You said the piyot, and you went straight to the Baruch Atah Hashem at the end of the bracha, Chatima. So there's a law, there's a halacha that in the winter we're obligated to mention rain in the second bracha. So if you're not saying the text of the bracha, you're only saying the piyot. You have to mention rain somewhere in the piyot. In the summer, while in the Mishnah there's no indication that you must mention dew. And also in the Talmud, there's no indication that you must, though there's hints in the Talmud Yerushalmi that there was a tendency towards that. In the time of the Paitanim, it seems that it was considered at least the Paitanim of Eretz Yisrael, like the Rebbe Lozer Berbi Kilir, that it was considered an obligation. You absolutely had to mention dew. So we haven't mentioned it yet in the Piyot. We need to mention the Churuj. So Tululim, Bitchia, Tululim, that fulfills your obligation to mention dew with life-giving. The idea that dew brings life. Each morning, dew brings life. And at the ultimate resurrection, dew will fall upon the dead and resurrect them, be dewed with life-giving, which will spring up. Baruch Atah Hashem, Chayei Hametim. And that's the end. Next time, we'll deal with the Mishalesh.